David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So we unfortunately have to have today what is a very real but admittedly depressing conversation, and it's really about the future of the United States, be it Biden or Trump who wins in November. And I want to approach this from a slightly different angle, so let me sort of set it up for you. The starting point is that in all likelihood, more than 60 million Americans are going to vote for 4 more years of Donald Trump in November. They will have seen what we saw for the last 3.5 years, and they're going to say, I'm going to vote for 4 more years of that. And the important context here is that certainly, depending on who wins the election, we are changing the direction of the country in the sense that if Donald Trump gets another 4 years, that's one direction. If Joe Biden replaces Donald Trump, that's a completely different direction. But I was having a conversation yesterday with former producer Lewis, and we were talking about sort of the outlook for the country. And inevitably, these discussions come up about, if Biden wins, then this, or if the Senate goes to Democrats, then that, or if Trump, then this other path goes forward. And of course, the November election results are going to have major consequences. We've been looking at policy differences over the last several months. And when you look at tax policy, yesterday, Donald Trump, during his press briefing, saying that he would actually be cutting the capital gains tax, whereas Joe Biden wants to tax capital gains as ordinary income, which would be, these are really large differences in policy. Look at Green New Deal elements that Joe Biden is including in his climate plan versus what Donald Trump has done. Just look at almost any policy and you see that these are very different trajectories. But there's a really big difference in terms of outcome versus the makeup of the country. And when it comes to voting, in all likelihood, somewhere between 60 million and 66 million people are going to vote for Donald Trump. And maybe the range is a little bigger. Maybe it's like at least 58 million and probably no more than 68 million people are going to vote for Donald Trump. But around 60 million people are going to say, this is the guy I want. So the point I'm making is that even if we set the country on a different path in January by electing Joe Biden in November, if Donald Trump is indeed removed, somewhere around half of the voters will have voted for Donald Trump. And this is not trivial. This has real consequences day to day for you and for me beyond what the president does. So certainly, if you think about climate, putting in Biden instead of Trump will make a massive difference. But depending on where you live, half of the school committee you might be involved in will be made up of Trump voters. Police officers, doctors, accountants, the people that we are going to be interacting with on a daily basis, even if Joe Biden ekes out a win over Donald Trump from the standpoint of the Electoral College, these folks aren't going away, and their ideology doesn't get changed or fixed because their candidate loses the Electoral College. And I don't know what the answer to that is. And we've talked before in these segments about Trumpism doesn't end when Donald Trump leaves office, be it in January or January of 2025. That's not just a catchphrase. It's not trivial. It's not unimportant. It's extraordinary, really. And how do we start thinking about that? Because it's such a bigger issue. And, there's this phrase that's often mentioned. It's something like, Trump didn't create racists, but they're just more comfortable out in public right now. Much along the same lines, Donald Trump did not create anti-intellectualism or pseudo-intellectualism. We've done interviews and I've explained to you that those ideologies have been around since the 1800s in some form approximating what we have today. And they have been coalesced into a sort of voting bloc at this point. We saw it with George W. Bush and we see it even more with Donald Trump. And so this is a bigger picture issue. There's no doubt that much more than George W. Bush, Donald Trump has sort of coalesced and emboldened this non-thinking crowd. But once the election's over, and hopefully Trump leaves this January, it might not be until January of 2025, it remains to be seen, what happens with that anti-intellectual, non-thinking, Trumpist ideology that doesn't go away. What happens in the Senate? What happens in the House of Representatives? This is not trivial, and it's something that we really have to think about. And no matter who wins the presidency, there will be somewhere around 60 to 65 million people who say, what I saw the last 3.5 years, I voted for more of it. Hopefully they won't get it, but we'll still have to deal with those people. And that gets me to the next topic I want to discuss with you today, which actually relates to the popular vote, sort of in this context. So let's talk about that next. In the immediate, there is no better time than now to talk a little bit about the plans for people who are voting in very blue states and in very red states, who maybe are planning to vote third party, maybe you're planning not to vote at all, because the outcome in your state is essentially determined. Now, as most of you probably know, in the United States, we don't have a national popular vote. We have an electoral college. So if you win a state as a presidential candidate by just one vote, you get all of that state's electoral votes, and it has no impact on what happens in other states. It's really 50 individual elections. Because of that system that we have, really, the election is determined by a dozen or so battleground states, or swing states as they're sometimes called. So these include places like Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Florida, etc. And it's very common that people in very blue or very red states who are on the left will say to me, I get these phone calls, I hear from people in person, etc. They'll say, I live in Utah. Biden's not going to win. I might vote third party, or I might not vote, or whatever. And then I'll hear from people in states like my state of Massachusetts who say Biden is winning by, what is it at this point, 30, 40? It's crazy what Biden's winning by in Massachusetts. It doesn't really require my vote to make sure Biden gets Massachusetts electoral vote. So I might vote. Maybe I'll vote Green Party to give them some support or whatever. If there was ever an election where that is not the approach that we should have, it is this one. If there was ever an election where every blue state and red state voter needs to make sure that you are voting for Joe Biden, it is this one. And you probably can guess why I'm going to make this point. There is a very real possibility that Donald Trump will claim that the election wasn't fair, that it was rigged, that the results are wrong. And in particular, if it's very close, nationally or within the key states that end up being the determining factors, we may have a situation where not only do we not know the results on November 3rd, I mean, with the number of mail-in ballots we're going to have, it's certainly reasonable and not a problem for me that maybe we don't know the results until November 6th or 7th. I want the right results rather than the fast results. But put that aside for a second. We could again end up with a situation where the Supreme Court gets involved here. And some people sent me a clip of Sam Cedar recently talking about this, saying, we might not know who won on Tuesday. And Trump will, in all likelihood, claim that he won. Lawsuits may start in a variety of different states, and it could be a never-ending battle. So we need a large margin in every single state, and also we want the largest possible popular vote margin. Why? Well, because if it does get to either secretaries of state or Supreme Court justices, the more overwhelming the defeat is of Donald Trump, if we are going to get one, the more difficult it's going to be for Supreme Court justices to justify funny business, we'll leave it at that, which could end up handing the election to Donald Trump. There's no guarantee. As we know, the Supreme Court is liable to do anything at any time. But the point is, winning the popular vote by 3 million votes, which is roughly what Hillary Clinton did in 2016, while still seeing Donald Trump become president with an electoral college victory, that's just going to be too close. And if this extends a few days into weeks because of lawsuits and on into the Supreme Court, particularly while Donald Trump is trying to kneecap the Postal Service to try to prevent vote by mail absentee ballots from being delivered, we need to do everything we can to avoid small margins anywhere. We want to avoid small margins in the states that will be close. We want to avoid small margins or smaller margins than we could have in California and Massachusetts. We need to run the score up. And if the election comes down to a couple of states and the popular vote is closer rather than less close, it just better enables Donald Trump to claim whatever the hell he plans to claim. If we overwhelm the vote so much that Trump is crushed in the popular vote, the claims are just slightly harder to make seriously. California has millions and millions of Democrats, and Joe Biden's clearly going to win. Who cares? Go out and vote and run up the score in California. Massachusetts will easily go to Joe Biden. You'd better believe I'm going to be voting and encouraging everybody I know who votes in Massachusetts to be voting. Everybody has to vote because we have to, I don't know of a better term than to run up the score. And then and only then, if we succeed in removing Donald Trump, then we go back to what I discussed earlier, which is we will have to deal with Trumpism and the 60, 62, 64, 66 million people who will have seen the last 3.5 years and will say, yeah, give me another 4 years of that. Following Sam Cedars' logic on this, which I think is sound, it's possible that overwhelming margins could sway one Supreme Court justice. You don't have to, if it's going to be 5-4 in some decision over some lawsuit that Trump files, if it's going to be 5-4, an overwhelming popular vote victory, swinging one of those 9 votes could make all the difference in who ends up being president as of January 20th, 2021. And voting is something we can all do. It's our right. Let's exercise it. August 23rd is the 15-year anniversary of the David Pakman Show. We will have a huge membership special. I can't say any more about it because it's borderline illegal, certainly immoral, but maybe even illegal in some states. Be notified of this great membership special by grabbing a membership, by getting on our newsletter at davidpakman.com. You will then on August 23rd be notified of how to take advantage of this great membership discount.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Christine Cedarstrand and Dale Carter. Christine and Dale, thank you so much for your support, and also a big thank you to Michael O'Brien. Michael's been a member for almost 5 years, if you can believe that, and is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Consider yourselves invited to grab a membership at joinpakman.com, and you will get the daily bonus show. It's an extra show every single day for our subscribers. Very exciting. Joinpakman.com. And if you want a discount, don't feel obligated, but you can take it. The coupon code THISIS2020, because it is, This is 2020, will save you 40%. Yesterday's press briefing with Donald Trump was outrageous. His mind seemed to sort of turn to mush before our very eyes with bizarre claim after bizarre claim. I'm going to give you very little lead up and just get right into the clips. I've gotten some complaints recently. David, get to the clips, talk about them after. So let's just do it. Clip number 1.
Yeah, please, Jeff.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to ask you a question about something you said in Bedminster as well. You said that you're planning to issue an executive order to ensure that health insurance companies prevent or cover people with pre-existing conditions, and you said that that had never been done before, but that's not the case because that is the law under the Affordable Care Act. So my question is, why do you need to issue an executive order for law that is already existing?
But I didn't say. I said as an executive order. As you said as an executive order. It hasn't been done before. We want to be able to assure people that pre-existing condition is always taken care of.
This is truly one of the dumbest things I've heard Trump say. And Jeff Mason, you might remember, I just dealt with this yesterday on the show. Jeff Mason, the reporter, is spot on. Pre-existing conditions are already covered in the United States. They've been covered for 10 years. They must be covered by health insurance companies. You can't be denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions. Because of Obamacare, we do not need an executive order for something that's a law. And Trump comes up with this idea. And as you can see, when he's pushed to come up with stuff on the spot, it doesn't go well. Trump says, well, I want to redouble it because it's never been mandated by executive order. So we just want to be like extra sure. This is absolutely ridiculous. This is like saying, murder is only illegal by law. We've never outlawed murder by executive order. we sort of need an executive order from a president against murder because otherwise we only have a law against killing other people. We don't have an executive order. I have a hard time imagining a dumber argument for why you would need an executive order for something that's already the law. Tax fraud is only illegal by law. Why hasn't Trump passed an executive order saying we are not going to allow tax fraud in the United States? It's as dumb as it sounds, okay? Let's continue now on the topic of 160,000 American deaths due to coronavirus.
If 160,000 people had died on President Obama's watch, do you think you would have called for his resignation?
No, I wouldn't have done that. I think it's been amazing what we've been able to do. If we didn't close up our country, we would have had 1.5 or 2 million people already dead. We've called it right. Now we don't have to close it. We understand the disease. Nobody understood it because nobody's ever seen anything like this.
So the question is a good one. If coronavirus hit when Barack Obama was president and we had 160,000 deaths, would you, Donald Trump, be calling for the resignation of Barack Obama? And Trump says no. And of course, there's a tweet for everything. There's actually 4 or 5 tweets, but just to show you one, Donald Trump did call for Barack Obama's resignation because one guy with Ebola got into the United States through an American airport. Trump tweeted back in 2014, days before the 2014 midterms. And you might remember that the day after the 2014 midterms, we never heard another word about Ebola because it actually was not an outbreak of any importance in the United States. Trump said, if this doctor who so recklessly flew into New York from West Africa has Ebola, then Obama should apologize to the American people and resign. But resign over 160,000 dead? No, he would never call for that. Because why? It's Trump this time. That's actually the only difference. Next, again, with 1917. Listen closely to this one.
The closest thing is in 1917, they say, right? The great pandemic certainly was a terrible thing where they lost anywhere from 50 to 100 million people. Probably ended the Second World War. All the soldiers were sick. That was a terrible situation. And
so again with the 1917 stuff. Now, of course, the 1918 flu was in 1918. We've interviewed historians who are experts in the 1918 pandemic. I asked in very clear and simple terms, is there any logical reason you can think of why Donald Trump would call it the 1917 flu? No reason that we can think of. But then Trump says the 1917 flu, which is really the 1918 flu, probably ended World War II. Now, if you are even remotely connected to time and the fact that it moves forward, as far as we know, with our human understanding of it, World War II was decades after the 1918 flu pandemic. I can't make any sense of it. Maybe he meant World War I, which would also be wrong, but at least it would be in the ballpark in terms of the right decade. Trump asked about 100,000 kids, nearly 100,000 kids, testing positive for coronavirus in the last 2 weeks of July. That's a very short period of time. And Trump insists schools should open. And yes, he insists that children are basically immune.
On coronavirus, 97,000 children tested positive for coronavirus in the last 2 weeks in July, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. Does that give you any pause about schools reopening for in-person learning?
because they may have, as you would call it, a case. It may be a case, but it's also a case where there's a tiny fraction of death, tiny fraction, and they get better very quickly. Yeah, they may have it for a short period of time, but as you know, the seriousness of it in terms of what it leads to is extraordinarily small, very, very much less than 1%.
So do you still believe that children are essentially immune?
Yeah, I think that for the most part they do very well. I mean, they don't get very sick.
The truth is that every week we learn more about kids actually being very efficient carriers of coronavirus. Now, some get very sick. It's not that common. That's true. But kids can be huge vectors of spreading the disease. And in fact, there was I I don't know now if it was like it might have been some kind of Christian summer camp. I don't remember exactly, somewhere in the Midwest. And they had a big outbreak. And as they tested the kids, the younger cohorts had more and more coronavirus. So, if you take like the 13 to 17, they had less than the 12 to, 8 to 12. And then the really young kids had even more. So this appears to be completely wrong, but the facts don't matter. They really don't matter. And unfortunately, it's not just to Trump that they don't matter. They don't matter to his followers either. So now let's get to Trump's new strategy to try to say how great we're doing on coronavirus. I'm not going to tell you what you're going to see here, but see if you can spot the strategy.
Including the short term and the lab tests. The lab tests take a little bit longer. And Dr. Birx was telling me a little while ago that we're down to 2 days and 2.5 days on getting your result on the lab test. The other ones, you get them in 5 minutes to 15 minutes, so that's exciting. But countries in every continent are seeing increases in cases. In recent days, cases have rapidly increased in Japan and Australia, unfortunately, and they're now experiencing higher peaks than they did in March. To the south of our border, cases have continued to surge in Mexico, Central America, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and throughout Latin America. It's really the hot spot. It's posing a major challenge for this continent. Latin America is now the region with the most number of confirmed cases by far, despite a relative scarcity of testing.
So Trump mentions Japan and Australia. Japan and Australia are having second waves, so everybody's in trouble and the U.S. really isn't that bad off. There's actually a lot here to understand. So first of all, when you look at a country like Australia, Australia has, as of this morning, 331 coronavirus deaths total. That number is maybe giving you a double take. Could that really be true? Yes, total 331 Australians have died from coronavirus. We often have 500 deaths in one day, 1,000 deaths in one day, 1,500 deaths in one day. At the peak, we had even more. Australia does have a recent uptick in cases, but only up to a few hundred cases per day. We have 40,000 cases a day, 60,000 cases a day, 80,000 cases a day. But the real difference is that Australia has immediately started shutting back down and extending guidelines. Whereas in the United States, when we have 40, 60, 80,000 cases a day, you get people parroting talking points like, we have a lot of cases because we test so much, and we certainly don't need to close anything. Trump mentioned Japan, very similar. Japan has a population of 125 million. That's about 35% of the population of the United States. Okay, they have 1,000 deaths total, okay? Per capita, Japan's death rate is dramatically lower than the United States. And Trump is right. Japan is seeing more cases over the last 10 days. They have a fraction of the cases we do per capita, and they are immediately expanding guidelines and shutting things down. So comparing the US to Australia and Japan, first of all, has to be done on a per capita basis. But most importantly, they are seeing cases go up and they are shutting down because they are taking it seriously. We are not. One little clip here about car companies. Check this out.
12 million. We're 12 million above expectations, which is pretty remarkable. Today we had great reports on new job openings, and there's clearly a housing boom, which has been incredible numbers in both housing and an automobile boom. We've rarely seen anything like it, and it's going on right now in America. Inventories are at rock bottom. Used car sales are at record levels. And we will have rebuilt. We're doing a rebuilding like nobody's ever seen. It's a big plus for manufacturing and construction. So construction's getting close to record territory. Manufacturing's doing very well. The car companies are doing great. Very happy for Michigan, the state of Michigan. We have a lot of car companies moving in. A lot of plants are being built and expanded in Michigan and Ohio.
Now, just about everything Trump says there is a lie. Claiming everything is at a record high, construction's at a everything's just doing better than ever. But he makes the very specific claim that car companies are moving into Michigan and Ohio. I looked around, I was able to find no evidence of that. And, there really aren't that many automakers. So when you make a claim like automakers are just moving into Michigan and Ohio and opening stuff up, it's really easy to fact check because there aren't that many automakers, quite frankly. And again, a provable lie. Here's one where I'll introduce a little bit more. Trump got an actual policy question. That was not just kind of rant about coronavirus for 2 minutes. And he just can't discuss policy in any depth whatsoever. He has nothing to say. This is a Brazilian reporter. Check this out.
Did you ask the U.S. ambassador in Brazil to focus his efforts in eliminating ethanol tariffs in Brazil?
You can't, yeah.
You asked the ambassador in Brazil to focus his efforts to eliminate ethanol tariffs in Brazil?
We haven't really discussed that too much, but at some point we probably will be. And we don't want people tariffing us. And if they tariff us, although I must tell you, I have a very good relationship with President Bolsonaro. He's great. And I hear he's doing well. He's recovered from having COVID-19, as they say. And that's great. And send him my regards. I think that as far as Brazil is concerned, if they do tariffs, we have to have an equalization of tariffs. And we are going to be presenting something having to do with tariffs and fairness in tariffs, because we have many countries for many years that have been charging us tariffs.
He just mutters coronavirus, Bolsonaro. We have a good relationship. COVID-19, as they say. Say hello to him for me. If they do tariffs, we do tariffs. No ability whatsoever to discuss policy in detail. And then here's the last one. Trump again with his predictions about the future of coronavirus.
And people should vote like they did in World War I and World War II. And your numbers will be, in 90 days or less, your numbers will be very good, I think, much better on the coronavirus or the China virus. But it's something you have to look at and say, this is just crazy. This just came out, 500,000 incorrect ballot applications sent all over the state of Virginia.
So before changing topic randomly there, Trump says in 90 days, things will be good. This is the guy who, was it March or April, where he said 15 cases are soon going to be 0. He has no idea about any of this stuff. Nothing he predicts can or should be taken seriously. And you really saw during this press briefing, Donald Trump's mind becoming mush. There's just nothing there. There's no critical thinking. There's no analysis. There's no connection to the facts. And sadly, as I mentioned earlier in the show, 60, 62 million, 64, 66, maybe 68 million Americans are going to vote for 4 more years. If that doesn't motivate you to vote, regardless of the state you live in, there's probably nothing that will motivate you to vote. We'll have more coverage of this on the David Pakman Show Instagram, which is at David Pakman Show. You can follow me there as well at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Nicholas Carr, who's the author of several books on technology and culture, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. So great to have you on. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, David. It's my pleasure.
So to start with, I think there's probably a lot of people in my audience who generally have the sense that maybe over the last many years, it's become a little more difficult to do sort of deeper learning, focusing on one task for an extended period of time. There's some vague notion that maybe there's something about social media and 140 character posts that may be sort of retraining our brain to some extent. But how do you generally characterize the way that the modern internet and technology have changed the way that we mostly do our thinking?
I think human beings have trouble concentrating, have trouble screening out distractions in general. We're very distractible. And you really do have to practice that and train yourself to concentrate and focus. And I think what the internet does in general, and certainly social media in particular, is it doesn't give us either the opportunity or the encouragement to train ourselves and practice skills of attentiveness, because it just floods us with information that's interesting to us and grabs our attention, but in little chunks. And so my argument is that essentially what we pay to get this abundance of fast flowing information is our ability to concentrate. We can't tap into those deeper, more attentive ways of thinking.
Is there something that's adaptive from an evolutionary standpoint about being easily distracted, in the sense of you're building a fire, but there's a threat off in the distance, and so your mind goes to that shiny object or moving object or something along those lines?
I think that's exactly it. You can understand how in the distant past, in order to stay alive, in order to survive, you needed to know everything that was going on around you, particularly anything new, which might be a threat or might be an opportunity to eat or whatever. So the way our brains work is that we're rewarded with dopamine and other ways, little pleasure-producing chemicals, to gather information. And I think it's exactly that this is an evolutionary instinct that unfortunately we bring over into this new digital environment where there's no end to new bits of information to grab and briefly hold our attention.
One thing I've read and heard from some folks is the idea that there was a time in human history, not that long ago really, where there would be a big debate over a fact because we did not have facts so readily accessible on our phones. And that, I mean, this is a very sort of utopian outlook. Now that the facts don't need to be argued about, we just find them, we can devote more time, thanks to the internet and the ready availability of facts, to thinking about the implications of those facts or the future of humanity, how we should interpret that information or whatever the case may be. It feels intuitively like that's not what's going on, but what do you think about that idea anyway?
I think it does go on sometimes.
Oh, really?
I mean,
okay.
There are good uses of the internet and not so good. There are a couple of problems with that we've learned. One is that actually having a superabundance of information available means anybody can find support for any kind of belief, even if it's totally wrong. So the idea that we'd all share this base of facts turns out not to be right. Human nature gets in the way. And then the other problem with that is, I think when you're distracted all the time, when you're constantly taking in information, you don't have time in your own mind to make connections and associations between all the different pieces of information around you. And it's those associations and connections that are required to give you the bigger context to fit new information into. And that broadens your thinking, deepens your thinking. So yeah, we can Google all sorts of stuff on our phones or on our computers, but we're losing our ability to fit new information into a bigger context. And as a result, we're just kind of turning into, I would argue, information gatherers that don't necessarily have an ability to engage in a deeper conversation with one another or in a deeper train of thought within ourselves.
There's some interesting articles I'm reminded of about this idea of the political hobbyist, which seems very much related to what you're talking about, which is, given so much free access to information about what's taking place in the world politically, comments from elected officials, a lot of data, so to speak, there's arguably a less effective political activist that comes out of it because they are just consuming information, sort of as you're pointing out, and not actually taking that information and doing something with it to, political differences aside, try to influence sort of their community and their surroundings. Is that sort of the idea of what you're saying when you talk about information overload, which may not be particularly useful?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. I mean, what we know about people is that if you give them an unlimited amount of information, they'll go out and cherry pick the information that reinforces their existing biases, whether those biases are based on fact or fantasy or fiction or whatever. And so what happens, our hope when we started out with the net, with the web, was that we'd have such a broad array of information that people would go out and sample different opinions, different points of view, as you say, become better able to hear other people and influence them or be influenced by them. But what we found is that rarely happens, unfortunately. What does happen is we all go out in our little bubbles and gather the information that supports our existing biases, which ends up making those biases even stronger. Then we find a lot of people that share those biases, and that has a lot to do with the polarization we see today politically and socially, and an inability to talk beyond the group of people that shares our point of view.
To use a sort of economic term, there's arguably also a diminishing marginal utility to information for decision-making purposes, in the sense of, if you're buying a car, as an example, that first information that you obtain about, you probably have a budget, right? So the price of cars is very important. Do you need a 2 or 4 door car or a sedan or an SUV? Over time, the additional information seems to be less and less useful to actually getting to a decision, right? When you get to what are the spark plugs, what's the life of the LED bulbs or whatever, and maybe
Right.
that's also an idea to consider here.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something, and I hadn't really considered that. But and what happens, I think then, is one of two things. Either you become so obsessed by the details that you kind of you spend all your time gathering more and more less valuable information, and it prevents you from actually acting because you suffer information paralysis. And then the other thing is the deeper you dig, if we're talking about political speech, the more reasons you find to put other people at a distance, the more points of difference you start to uncover, even if they're trivial points, they loom large as you keep gathering more and more information without necessarily, as I said, fitting that information and understanding that information as a part of a bigger, broader context.
Yeah, that's something I've thought of in thinking about, for example, like the political divisions within the left, where, sure, you have some on the left who are almost moderate Republicans, as an example, and you have some on the left who are truly socialists. But really, there's probably, pick a number, 85, 90, I don't know what it would be. But there's a lot of overlap about sort of what the majority of those who consider themselves on the mainstream American political left would want. And yet, when you look at the discourse on places like Twitter and others, it seems overwhelmingly focused on the relatively small differences.
Yeah, in some ways that's nothing new. People have been subdividing themselves even when they share a broad understanding for a long time. But I do think the internet accelerates or exaggerates that already common occurrence. It provides not only all sorts of ways to find new points of distinction, but to find ever narrower groups that share your precise interests and your precise views. And as soon as you have that group formation, then even other groups who share a lot of your views seem like outsiders, seem like the enemy. And I do think that's part of the fragmentation we see even within groups of people who you would think would focus on their points of agreement.
To go back where we started about the effect of the internet on our brains and deep thinking, et cetera, when I interviewed Cal Newport previously and read some of his books, and he, at least to some degree, believes that these are issues of sort of training and thinking of the brain like a muscle, and that if you condition the brain to, you close a room and you just read 30 straight minutes, that you're building up a muscle essentially, and that this helps to push back against the instincts that may be pushed on us by sort of the status quo of Western technology and the internet. Is your take that the solution is a systemic one, that it's at the individual level, absent one, it has to be the other, or what's your thought on that?
I certainly think at this point, we've created a set of social norms and social expectations that essentially tell us we should always be online, always monitoring new information, always sending out or receiving messages. You get that from employers, you get that from schools, you get that certainly from your friends, from your relations. So I think it's a systemic issue at this point, and that doesn't mean there's not an individual component. And I think Cal Newport's analogy to building muscle is the right one. And what we know about neuroplasticity these days, the brain's malleability, is that you really do have to exercise ways of thinking if you want to retain them. Otherwise, they're going to weaken over time and ultimately disappear. And I think as individuals for a long time now, we've been training ourselves to gather information very, very quickly, to pull in bits of data in lots of overlapping forms, and we're getting good at that. But we have starved ourselves, in effect, or not exercised the ability to pay attention, which is hard for us to do, as I said. So I think if we want to change, you certainly have to pay attention to individual habits, but we also have to recognize that society is sending these very powerful messages that tell all of us, stay online, gather as much information as you can, and don't turn off the flow of information and practice the more attentive or contemplative ways of thinking that are possible for your mind, but don't come naturally to us.
We've been speaking with Nicholas Carr, and we're going to go to a break on the podcast, TV, and radio show. You can find our full conversation, which will continue on the YouTube channel.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So President Donald Trump has come to the realization that he probably needs fraud in order to win re-election in November. He needs to suppress the vote in order to have a solid shot at defeating Joe Biden. And his administration isn't even hiding it anymore. There's a new report, which I encourage you to read in Politico, explaining that Trump's aides, Trump's staffers, the people around him, know this, and they're now looking at any way they can come up with to suppress the vote, curb vote by mail, disenfranchise as many people as possible when they are people that are likely to vote for Joe Biden rather than Donald Trump. Now, you might remember last week I told you we shouldn't be that confident in Joe Biden's lead, and that's true. That hasn't changed. If you look at polls that have Biden up 9 and you see that there's a margin of error of 3.5, that means Joe Biden might only be up by 2. Hillary won by 2 in 2016 in the popular vote and still lost the Electoral College. That analysis from last week is true. And in particular, if anything changes between now and November that helps Donald Trump, a slightly improved economy, we'll talk about Q3 GDP numbers, which we will get literally 4 days before the election. We could see a 1 or 2 point swing away from Biden and towards Trump, and Trump gets reelected. So that's all true. But it is also clear that it's too close for comfort. And the report in Politico points out that there's a complete and total commitment from the Trump campaign to a strategy not of improving the country, not of improving the economy, not of dealing with coronavirus. The strategy is essentially fraud, to suppress the vote so that the will of the people is not accurately represented. This is not the type of fraud, by the way, that they claim exists. Trump now has spent 2-3 months, I guess, pushing the idea that there was in-person voter fraud back in 2016, and in 2020, there will be vote by mail fraud if more people vote by mail. Remember, Trump has not accepted the popular vote result of the 2016 election, which had him winning the presidency. Trump won electorally in 2016. He lost the popular vote by millions of votes. He still has not accepted that. And now he insists if we increase mail-in voting in 2020, it will be a fake, fraudulent, rigged election. There will be fraud, but the real fraud is what Trump is doing to suppress the vote. The real fraud is what Trump is doing to prevent vote by mail and to kneecap the post office. And we're already seeing bins of mail overflowing in post offices across the country as postal workers are restricted in being able to work overtime to get the mail delivered. If you want fraud in the sense of someone preventing the will of the people from being done, It's what Donald Trump and people around him are doing, and they have gone fully mask off. They're not even pretending otherwise. And when you actually look at the full list of what they're doing, it should be criminal. Now, if we want to give Trump a consequence, it's removing him in November, right? What he's doing should be criminal, but I mean, forget it, right? That's not going to be the way it's handled. You've got a massive effort in a bunch of states to file lawsuits to change voting rules when it comes to vote by mail and voting absentee. That includes Minnesota rather, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. Aides are trying to figure out what executive orders can Trump sign to just unilaterally curb mail-in voting through any possible means. They're looking at how can they stop mail-in ballots from being counted after Election Day. As many of you know, depending on state rules, as long as the postmark date of the mail-in ballot is before the election or no later than Election Day, it would still be counted, and usually mail within states doesn't take more than a couple of days to be delivered, and those ballots would be counted in the couple of days after Election Day. Trump is looking to limit that, and Trump is also looking, according to aides speaking to Politico, Trump is looking at, could he tell the Postal Service not to deliver certain ballots that states send out? All of this is on the table. Now, here is the really important message. A bunch of experts in voting have looked at everything that they are planning. They've looked at all of these ways in which Donald Trump could suppress the vote. And they've come to the conclusion that these techniques can only do so much. In other words, if you slow down mail delivery, okay, you can delay it, but if people vote early enough, if you send in your absentee ballot 2-3 weeks before the election, it's going to get there before Election Day, even if Trump slows down the Postal Service to some degree. A lot of this stuff is done at the state and local level. So the takeaway is slowing down the mail, finding executive orders to hamper delivery of mail-in ballot, all of this different stuff. It can only do so much. And if we overwhelm the vote, it's going to be more powerful than anything Trump can do from what's been floated so far. So yes, at the state and local level, between now and November, we need to do everything we can to push governors and election officials to run the election properly, to not allow these dirty tricks to actually take hold. We need to do everything we can. Yes, at the federal level, we've got Trump's postmaster general who needs to continually be dragged before House committees to testify and to be put on the defensive about what he's doing. But he still might get away with some of this stuff. But in the end, the cumulative effect of all of these techniques, all of these ideas, it can only do a little bit of suppression. If our turnout is low, it could hand the election to Donald Trump. If our turnout is high, it will not make a difference. If we overwhelm the vote, and that includes when you can safely vote in person, doing it, when you can vote by mail, sending in your ballot 2, 3, 4 weeks early, meaning if it takes an extra 5 days to be delivered, it's not going to be a problem. These techniques cannot put Trump back in the Oval Office if we vote. And that's the good news. Now, we also can't ignore the foreign meddling piece. And that's what I want to talk about next. I hope that we're able to have this next conversation as adults. And please watch the entire video, listen to the entire story before commenting. I'm begging you. I hate to admit this, but I've delayed talking about this for a few days because I know that even bringing it up triggers some people off a cliff into irrationality. But at this point, I would be doing a disservice if I didn't talk about this. So I'm going to break it down as simply as I can. Russia is once again meddling in the election in order to help Donald Trump. Now, disclaimer, listen very, very carefully here. This does not mean Donald Trump is actively participating or coordinating anything with Vladimir Putin. This does not mean that Russia is coordinating with Trump. What this means is that Russia is doing what they do all over the world and what they've done for a very long time, and what the United States does all over the world. This is a really important message here. I'm not alleging anything. It's the intelligence community. It is not being alleged that Russia is doing anything special right now. Russia has a long history dating back decades, really like 100 years, of using a series of tactics, depending on the situation, to exert influence on foreign elections. Now, for everybody, let's go through some of the responses people are going to send me. What about China and Iran? I'll talk about China and Iran in 2 minutes, so let's wait. What about the fact that the U.S. also meddles in elections? You're right, but I'm not. Of course, the U.S. meddles in elections. That's not what this story is about. This is about our election being meddled in. If you are against Trump and you want the will of the people to be heard and for it to be the will of the people that determines the next president, right now we are talking about Russian meddling to help Trump in the next 3 months. That's the topic of this story. It doesn't mean some other thing isn't a valid story. Americans meddling in Nicaragua decades ago is true, interesting, and important historically. It's just not what this story is about. So don't distract with that. So what do we know? Russia is pushing their standard disinformation campaigns targeting Joe Biden. They're spreading disinformation to hurt Joe Biden. The American intelligence community has been briefing elected officials about this now for some time. Russia is working to help Donald Trump by attacking Biden. And meanwhile, China and Iran are working to hurt Trump. This is not just Russia, but you can't deny the Russia piece. That's the important thing. Russia prefers Trump, China and Iran prefer Joe Biden based on everything we know right now. Doesn't make anybody better or worse. It's simply what is taking place right now. The Russian interference is not merely about Trump per se, and it's not even about Trump specifically. It's about Russia's bigger plan to destabilize Western democracy. Anybody who thinks Russia's preferences are specifically about Trump as a person, you're mostly missing the big picture. Russia plays a big picture game. The game is sow discord in Western democracies to make people within those countries and around the world think, wow, democracy doesn't seem to be working so well in these countries. The more that Western democracies lose credibility, the better Russia looks in comparison. That's the idea. Making it a reality is another story. Now, in terms of their reactions to this nationally, Democrats and Republicans are just not the same. On many issues, if you've been watching this program, listening to the podcast, you know that I point out, here's an issue on which there is very little daylight between Democrats and Republicans. And when that's the case, we talk about it. On this issue, since 2016, Democrats have sought time after time to stop and prevent this type of meddling. Republicans have gotten in the way of trying to stop this type of meddling. Mitch McConnell has gotten in the way of dealing with this. Donald Trump has done nothing about it. So please understand, there's not anything conspiratorial here. Powerful countries try to influence elections around the world. Assuming you agree that's true, there's no particular reason to doubt Russia having a preference, and that preference being Donald Trump, because it's coherent with their geopolitical strategy dating back for decades. The U.S. does it, you're right. China does it, yes. Iran does it, absolutely. And so does Russia. There's no reason that we should be particularly skeptical of that. Why would we deny it? It doesn't make any sense. The claim, once again, just as a reminder, is not that Trump and Putin are working together right now. The claim is from the Intelligence Committee that the U.S. election is just another one, and Russia is interested in the outcome, China is interested in the outcome, Iran is interested in the outcome. They have different preferences. Russia's preference is for Trump to win, and Russia's tactics are likely more sophisticated than those employed by China and Iran, because Russia has been doing this for a very long time. Don't be defensive in the sense that accepting that doesn't mean you have to accept anything else. You don't have to accept anything that goes into speculation. But there are people that get very defensive when this is brought up and they start talking about red scares and all sorts of wacky stuff. It's very straightforward. There's nothing unique here. Let's identify it for what it is. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's an interesting voicemail that came in this morning.
Hi, David. This is Jerry from Queens, New York again. I'm actually very nervous about this election. What do you think the odds are that he's going to be able to disrupt it in some manner or some form, Trump? Because we are living in a dictatorship now. Democracy is dead. It's terrifying, but democracy is dead. And I fear that my granddaughter, who's now 9 months old, is going to grow up in an entirely different country than I did. Goodbye, and thanks for all your reporting, and good luck. Stay healthy.
Okay, so but listen, I get the frustration. We have a president with dictatorial, authoritarian tendencies and a sort of wish for that. He's a wannabe. You are correct that many of the democratic institutions of this country are in crisis and they are in jeopardy. But to go further right now and to say this is a dictatorship is simply not accurate. I do think it's important to be, on the one hand, warning people about signs and symptoms, but on the other hand, we don't want to be hyperbolic. But the frustration, I'm with you. We have an opportunity to do something about it very soon. Let's actually do it. We've got a great bonus show planned for you today. We will talk about the upcoming RNC and DNC conventions and our plans for coverage. We will talk about this maskless rally of motorcyclists in South Dakota and much more. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming members at joinpacman.com. I'll see you then.